This is Lilium. She was a lifelong companion to one of my friends from the age of 16 to 32. Sadly, Lilium recently and very unexpectedly passed away, and when my friend was relating this story to me, how she held Lilium in her arms in their final moments together, the idea came to me to capture this moment in a sculpture. Not a portrait of Lilium and my friend, but rather a fantastical scene that will hopefully capture the emotion of what happened. So, with permission from my friend, that is exactly what I'm going to do. To that end, I'm going to reimagine Lilium as a gigantic tiger. As usual, I'm working in sixth scale, so the tiger being about 30 inches long in sculpture means that she's equivalent to about a 20-foot long tiger in real life. This is, as I said, gigantic. But for me, this size represents the outsized influence that our pets can have on our lives. If you're not a pet owner, you may not understand how deep this bond can be, but for many people, their pets truly are part of the family. Now, look, obviously, this is a pretty heavy topic, but I'm going to try not to narrate in such a serious tone the whole time. Ultimately, this is a fantastical sculpture that happens to be inspired by real life tragedy, but the process is the process, and that's what this video is about. So, if I crack a joke here and there, I hope you understand that I'm not meaning to be disrespectful. It's just going to be depressing to keep a super serious and somber tone the whole time. Anyway, it took me a couple of tries, but eventually I got the tiger's proportions into decent shape. If you saw the reference skeleton printout that I built the armature around, that was actually a picture of a saber-toothed tiger skeleton from a museum. I had chosen that because I had initially meant to make the tiger kind of a magical big cat and not necessarily a tiger specifically. But the more I worked on it, the more I wanted it to be actually tiger-like. So that's what I eventually landed on, and I guess ended up fighting the initial armature quite a bit. Maybe I should have just remade the whole thing from scratch once I figured out that the build-up was problematic, but I felt committed, so I just made it work and moved on. Anyway, we're going to set the tiger aside for the moment and make the form for the girl. In this case, we're going for someone around 16 or so, about 5 feet tall, so definitely on the small side as sixth scale characters go. The reason I went with someone younger is because I wanted a sense of vulnerability, innocence, and uncertainty that a full-grown adult wouldn't necessarily convey. Let's take it to the extreme, right? If the tiger was paired with a 50-year-old lady, the sculpture would feel very different. Lilium, the cat, also came into my friend's life when she was 16 as well. The friend was 16, not the cat, so about mid-teens feels appropriate for the piece. Now that we've got the two basic forms put together, we have to compose the scene. I want this to be a very gentle, private, and intimate moment. I want the girl to hug the tiger very closely, but not like a tightly wound, I'm never letting you go kind of way. I want this piece to be about acceptance. It's a tragedy, but also it's happened, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, there it is. The mock-up slash composition, anyway. The girl and the tiger in their very last moment together. Now, normally I'd get right into shaping the characters next, but in this case, I'm going to build up the base to replace these blocks of wood and clay. The characters in this piece are very tightly integrated into the base, so I want to be more certain of what the shapes on the base are going to be before I overcommit to shaping the models. I'm doing this by building up a giant mound of aluminum foil, which I then cover up with copious amounts of Sculptamold. Sculptamold, as far as I can tell, is basically a mixture of plaster and paper fiber. It's really great for building up terrain and creating a natural, craggy look. When I was working on this, I did mix up a little too much, however. This was my first time working with the stuff, and I had no idea that the working time was so short, like 15 minutes at best. It will stay wet for a very long time, but it gets pretty much unworkable after only about 15 minutes or so. So if you're doing something similar, I recommend working in small batches. But now that the base has been roughed in, I can get into shaping the characters, starting with the tiger. For now, the objective is to shape in the musculature. The plan is to sculpt in just the muscles, get it into good shape, and bake it hard before layering fur on top. To be completely candid, I'm a bit nervous about my ability to get the tiger looking like a tiger because I've never sculpted a tiger before and certainly not one of this size. So I'm separating the two steps in this way in the hopes that the sculpt becomes a bit more manageable. In retrospect, I would not use this method again. There's a bunch of videos of people sculpting tigers on YouTube, and basically no one else does this. And there's a reason for that. Fur is not like clothing. You can't really sculpt the animal muscles and put fur on top like I usually do clothing because fur is so much more integral to the shapes that you perceive on the animal, and doing it in this way will ultimately make controlling the shapes much more difficult in the fur stage, as you will see later in this video. That said, I don't regret using this method on this piece because, as I said, I did not know how to sculpt a tiger when I started. I've only kinda sorta sculpted a big cat once before on some other random piece. And doing the musculature first allowed me to study the anatomy of a tiger in a way that wasn't really possible if I had combined the muscle and fur layers into a single baking pass. So while I don't recommend this method for sculpting a tiger, it did teach me a lot about tigers and successfully allowed me to tackle this really massive sculpture in smaller steps. I don't think I would have been able to complete the sculpture otherwise, so even if the results are suboptimal, I'm still glad I did it this way. And this isn't theory, by the way. I know that combining fur and muscles into a single baking pass is a better method because that's what I opted to do for the head, and it yielded a far superior result. Again, you'll see that later in this video. And to be very clear, I like the way the tiger looks in the end. It just took a lot of beating around the bush to get there. But for now, we're going to set the tiger aside once again and shift our attention back to the girl because I want to be working on the whole piece together and not over-concentrate on one thing or another. Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that the girl was a little further along in that last shot with the tiger just now. This is because I am once again showing the process to you slightly out of order from real life for good flow in the video. I don't know if it's obvious to everyone else, but for some reason I feel like it's going to be very confusing if you see things out of order without explanation. And this is a process video after all. If the process is confusing, then what is it for? Who knows, maybe I'm overthinking it, I certainly do with a lot of other things. For the girl's face, I start with a neutral expression as usual to make sure I get the basic structure right, but by far the most difficult part of sculpting the girl was the facial expression. Since she's the only human character in the piece, she's kind of carrying the emotional weight of the entire thing on her shoulders. If we don't believe that she's grieving for her friend, I think this piece is pretty much going to fall flat on its face. To that end, I spend extra effort working on her expressions, trying out different variations, checking my references, and just really giving it my all. I'll talk more about the reason I ended up choosing the particular expression that I did when I talk about the tiger's head, but for now I'll just say that it best fits the theme that I'm going for. When I started this piece, I had come up with an elaborate story about a young girl who lives in a village next to a mysterious forest, inhabited by a guardian deity that takes the form of a giant tiger. I wrote about how she was an adventurous, precocious young girl that went a little too deep in the woods and came face to face with its terrifying guardian, only to befriend the creature and became its dearest companion instead. And I wrote about how eventually a handsome young prince came to visit this backwater village and was so taken with the girl that he decided that he was going to rescue her from the clutches of this monstrous beast lurking in the forest and ended up killing the thing she loves most. But what I found out was that the more I tried to explain the scene and my choices, the more convoluted it got. Some things just don't need an overly explicit explanation. Because if I really wanted to start explaining the scene, I'd have to explain why I chose to put her essentially in a nightie with no shoes. I'd have to explain why there's no one else here. I'd have to explain why this mystical giant tiger can be killed by a single spear wound, and come up with a reason for why they're on this hill that's perfectly shaped for their pose. The truth is, I chose her wardrobe for the visual vulnerability. There's no one else here because this is meant to be a private, intimate moment. A simple spear is meant to convey the sudden and inglorious nature of the tragedy, and the hill is because it's simply a better visual to have the girl be on the highest ground on the piece. And I made all these decisions in order to best convey the emotion of the scene, to give you a certain impression that you can walk away with. As far as I'm concerned, that is the most important thing. But that's enough artsy fartsy talk for now because we have to talk technical for a while I work on the tiger's fur. I start by doing some homework and tested several fur texturing techniques before deciding on the version that I wanted to go with. But when I did the version on the tiger itself, it just looked too fluffy, too furry. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with a new tool to apply a sleeker looking texture on the model. And even though I won't keep this fur version either, spoiler alert, I still consider it a small win for the learning experience. After working on the short fur for a bit, I decided that maybe I ought to work on the tiger's fluffier white fur on the underside of the body and limbs instead, because these are quite voluminous, so it occurred to me that perhaps I should concentrate on the thing that's going to more heavily affect the shapes on the sculpture first. And you know what's funny? I also decided eventually that these fluffy white furs aren't really working either, so I carved them off and tried again and replaced them with something that honestly wasn't that much different. I can at least say that the one good thing about having pre-baked the tiger muscles in a previous step was that it made it really easy to reset and try a different fur version. It wasn't until right about here, when I'm working on the forelimbs, when I finally felt like I was starting to get a hold of what I wanted the fluffy fur to look like. So one problem solved, but the bad news is that here is also where I decided that I didn't actually like the short furs that I did with the cat claw either. First, it's too contrasty. I'm pressing too hard on the tool to make the texture, and I just didn't like how deep those shadows are. But more importantly, I felt like I was concentrating too hard on the texture and lost control of the actual shape of the tiger. It's lumpy everywhere, and fixing it is going to basically require me to redo the whole short fur thing completely. So instead, I came up with another tool, this time a twisted wire that I'm using to apply light texturing instead. Basically, I decided that the shapes are more important than the texture, and this is an opinion that I had before the sculpture and got reaffirmed while working on this piece. I don't really care that the texture isn't realistic. As I said, the shapes are more important, but this technique is also going to give me another benefit down the line that I'll show you later. I hope this has been interesting for you so far. Honestly, I'm so close to the project that I can't tell anymore, but all told, it took me about 45 hours of recorded sculpting time to do all the fur variations and finish the final version, so it felt like a disservice to myself and the sculpture to not include this crazy fur journey that I went on in this video. Anyway, now that the fur is shaping up, it is time to think about how to disassemble and reassemble the whole piece for painting, which means we need to jump back to the girl. The problem we need to address is the opening between her arms. They're too narrow for the girl to be installed and removed straight on like this. So I'm going to fix this by first cutting apart the girl at the dress's neckline, since that's a natural seam that could be easily hidden after painting. I didn't choose the wardrobe for this, like I said, it was for the visual vulnerability, but it does make it more convenient right now. But this isn't actually the cut that I need. I'm really looking to remove her right arm that's coming in under the tiger's neck, and that is what the first cut will allow us to do much more easily. So after I have taken the girl apart at the neckline, drilled some locating pins, and filled the gaps with epoxy, I took just the top half and cut off the right arm where I plan to put the dress's shoulder strap later. This strap will help me hide the seam in a way that the neckline hides the seam on the chest. If this doesn't make any sense, just keep watching. It'll all come together eventually. In addition to the right arm, I could have also taken apart the left as well, and that would have given me more access to the face for fine tuning and painting. But at the time, I wanted that side of the girl to be as cohesive and, well, seamless as possible. I will definitely come to regret this decision by the time I get to painting. The good news is, I can now more confidently sculpt the tiger's head, knowing that there's a hard point of reference to work from, that being the girl. I rigged up a way to sculpt the head in an upright position and went to town. When I decided to take on this project, acceptance of a tragedy wasn't exactly what I had in mind. I just had an image and an emotion. And as I continued to work on it and experimented with giving the tiger an openly sad or pained expression, this was back in the muscular refinement stage, it just didn't feel right. Honestly, it felt intrusive and exploitative, even though my friend had already given me the permission to use their story as a starting point. I did not want to make a video that took advantage of their tragedy, and acceptance felt more respectful of my friend's personal journey through this ordeal. So that's how I eventually landed on the theme of acceptance, and once that happened, it informed everything I did. It told me how tightly the girl should be hugging the tiger, it told me how to choose the right expression for the girl, and it told me how to pick the right expression for the tiger. In my mind, the tiger is telling the girl, it's okay. It will be okay. It's okay to let go. I think the tiger would want the girl to live on and be happy. I think that's what a true friend would want for their friend. And there I go again, talking about artsy emotional stuff when we suddenly have to switch back to the technical very shortly. I hope this is okay for you guys. The interweaving of the soft stuff and the hard technical stuff. I'll try not to make it so jarring in the future when there's a really emotional project on the docket, but for now, thank you for sticking with me. Okay, we've gotten a lot done, but there's still a lot left to do. First, I have to finish out the underside of the tiger. The process here is exactly the same as before, so I'm not going to talk about it in a whole lot of detail other than you just gotta get in there and get it done. Thankfully, it did go much faster than the top side because by now I already have the process down, and frankly, you're not going to see any of this anyway. I'm doing it just in case someone sees the sculpture in person and chooses to look at it from either eye level or from slightly below. I want there to be something there. I also went back and filled in any gaps in the original Sculpt-A-Mold pile to get it to fit just a little tighter and hide any exposed aluminum foil. But the biggest problem I face now is making the models fit together properly. I'm genuinely unsure what was going on, but it felt like things were shifting around slightly after every bake, with the biggest one happening about here, when the entire sculpture went in the oven together and the girl came out with a new gap around the seam that wasn't there before. So instead of trying again and again to bake and hope nothing goes wrong, I'm going to switch gears and basically complete the sculpture using epoxy clay from now on, because epoxy clay chemically hardens and doesn't require baking. Outside of fixing the gaps in the parts, there's a lot of other little fixes and adjustments to be had in this final refinement stage. There's too many little things to talk about, but basically anything you see in white is something that I worked on. This is not the funnest part of sculpting, to be frank, but it is important. I think these little details really matter, like the exact curve of a certain line or the exact placement of the fingers, etc., etc. And sometimes it can feel like you're not making much progress because you change one thing and it affects another, so you have to chase that down. But put all the little changes together, and I think it makes a really big difference in the finished piece. And I'm not going for perfection, by the way. If you look closely, you're going to see all kinds of little flaws here and there. It's more about what flaws I can and can't live with. Speaking of things I can't live with, remember I told you that simplifying the short fur texture has another benefit that would arrive later? Well, here we are now. What I'd noticed at this point is that I still had not gotten the tiger's overall shapes back in order. Look at this particular view right here and see how thin the waistline and the hips are, and how big the shoulders are. Now, look at this photo of a tiger taken from top view. Look at how sleek and streamlined the creature in the photo is. This I cannot let go. And to be frank, I had been feeling for a while that something was off about this piece, and that's what prompted me to go back and look at a bunch of tiger references to see what the problem was. And yeah, it's pretty much the proportions of the whole thing. I had completely lost control of the proportions while doing fur as a layer instead of as part of the tiger herself. Did I mention the tiger's female? Lilium was female, so the tiger is female. Anyway, now I have to add a whole bunch of material and carve away a whole bunch more to get the tiger into shape. And I can say with certainty that doing the tiger's musculature separately is a key reason for why I had the confidence to make this fix now. I can see what was wrong and I knew what to do to fix it. And even though it's not a perfect fix, I can honestly say that at the end of this step, I was much happier with the shape of the tiger as a whole than I was before. This is why I said earlier that I don't regret doing the muscle and the fur separately, even though it was not the best overall way of doing things, because it gave me the knowledge and the confidence to do this. And the fact that the simplified fur texture is easy to apply helped to keep me from worrying about having to redo them all. So, it all worked out in the end. I alluded to this earlier, but in real life, Lilium the cat's passing was quite sudden. She was an old cat, of course, but what happened was still very unexpected. One day she was fine, the next day my friend was in the emergency room with Lilium in her arms, wondering what was going to happen. And just a few days after that, my friend had to make the decision to let Lilium go. This is why I've chosen to have the tiger be mortally wounded by a simple spear. No decorations, no gilding, no banners. This isn't about some epic battle that the tiger fought. It's about an unexpected thing that happened, and I didn't want to glorify the cause at all. And again, this also isn't about being literal with the story. It's about an impression and a feeling. So that's why the spear. Okay, we're pretty much done with the sculpting, but before we get to painting, because the base is so large and the contact point between the models and the base are so big, I'm actually going to apply terrain paste now. The terrain paste is just a mix of plaster, Mod Podge, paint, and aquarium sand of various coarseness. This process, as expected, is a huge mess, and doing this now turned out to be an even better decision than I thought because I had to clean off a whole bunch of base material from the models after it was all said and done. If I had to do this after the models have been painted, it would have been kind of a nightmare to try and preserve the paint job while doing this at the same time. But with that, we are actually done sculpting. Here is the model all primed up. As you saw just now, this was quite a journey, months and months of work just to get to this point, but we are finally ready to paint, so let's get right to it. We are going to start with the tiger. Now, I say I want to start here, but I don't actually want to talk about any techniques or process at the moment because, truth be told, I did not know what I was doing. To study up for this project, I watched a bunch of tiger sculpting videos on YouTube and looked at what techniques and processes other people were using, and it won't surprise you to know that everyone did something a little or sometimes a lot different, and that's perfectly normal. There's more than one way to skin a cat, if you will. But that means I still had to decide what to do for my sculpture, so I picked out a few processes that I felt like was feasible for me and just gave it a try. But it didn't really work out the way I'd hoped. Either I chose the techniques poorly, or did not know how to use them properly, or just didn't do enough study on how tigers actually look. It doesn't really matter. Either way, after several sessions of following my initial plan, I had to admit it is not looking good. Flat out, to me, the tiger looked cartoony, lacked dimension, and the stripes looked exactly like what they were, paint on a model. I did not buy that they were furry stripes even a little bit. So, what to do? Well, I could just keep telling myself to try harder and to tough it out and to push through that inner critic that's screaming at me that I'm letting the story down and that I'm not good enough and that I have no business showing my work to the public. Yeah, this was not a good moment for me internally. Or I could try something different. While mental fortitude certainly is an important muscle to develop as an artist and a maker, I also think it's not particularly helpful to just say try harder to someone who's already trying really hard. So instead of just try harder, I took a step back, regrouped, reevaluated my current capabilities, and came up with a new plan. Here's how that went. Step 1. Repaint all the white parts. First with dark ivory, followed by a very light beige, specifically Vallejo off-white. It might not look very different in the video, but in person it made a huge difference. White is the extreme end of brightness as paints go, and to me it lacked dimension, as I was just saying. So taking it back, even just one tiny step and in 2 layers made it feel a lot warmer and gave it that depth that it was lacking before. Step 2. I repainted all the stripes with a detail airbrush to first expand the stripes that I felt was too thin and also to really fill in the crevices in the clay texture where the regular brush had a hard time with. Of course, this looks terrible because I did not have the skill with the airbrush that's needed to do something like this. I mean, you can see that the stripes are wobbly, unshapely, and did not come to a fine point like real tiger stripes do. And you can bet that I am panicking internally right now because it looks for all the world like I've ruined it. It wasn't great before, but it's really bad now. But I had to trust the process and believe in the plan that I had in my head because step 3, I can then cut back the stripes using yellow and sneak up on the right shape for each stripe. This method gave me a lot more control, and the huge benefit to this method is that it gave each stripe a fuzzy edge, which was convincing enough for me as kind of a fuzzy, furry, but still well-defined tiger stripes. Afterward, I can tint the yellow back to orange because of all the things about the first pass that I didn't like, the yellow to orange layering felt pretty good to me. Yes, this was tedious, and yes, it took a lot of that mental fortitude to essentially repaint the tiger in its entirety and push through when the first attempt at airbrushing the stripes looked so bad. But I'm really happy with how it turned out, so it was all worth it. However, even with the new method of airbrushing the stripes and cutting it back, I still didn't have enough control to paint the very fine and graphical stripes on the face. So I had to switch back to the paintbrush to work on this section. In fact, I repainted the entire head again using just the paintbrush because this gave me a better result than trying to blend the manual brushwork into the airbrushed parts. Of course, this means that the stripes on the face are sharper than the ones on the body, but that's okay because if there's something on the tiger that should be in sharp focus, it's the face. So I'm perfectly happy to call this an artistic choice. See, I can exercise some restraint. Other than that, we just have to clean up and finish off the various little details that tie it all together. I was actually quite unhappy with the position of the irises here, so I'll end up changing them and adding a UV resin finish off camera later, so be on the lookout for that in the final reveal. But with that, we are finally finished with the tiger, and it is time to move on to the girl, which is relatively straightforward as paint jobs go, if not necessarily easy. I chose quite a light skin tone for her because the tiger is orangey yellow, and I think this will create a better color contrast and better direct your eyes towards this end of the composition. I'm keeping the method simple by starting with the skin tone followed by some gentle pink shading, then some undershading. You can barely see this undershading in real life, it's just there to help blend the figure into the base just a touch more. For her dress, I went with sky blue, baby blue, which once again I wanted for color contrast since nothing else on this piece is blue. I'm giving it kind of a broad shine, going from sky blue to near white, then shaded in the recesses with a dark turquoise blue. Secretly, this is actually the second time I'm painting this dress because I had a strange paint peel issue where the paint was not sticking to the primer. Never had this happen before, and it didn't happen the second time around, so I have no idea what went wrong. But by now, I've dealt with so many paint peel issues that it doesn't faze me anymore, and I just took it as a second chance to do a better job painting the dress instead. Looking at this now, the shading on the dress creases probably came out a little bit dark, but I don't really mind because the girl is so light in tone overall that a little extra contrast isn't such a bad thing. For her hair, I'm going with a medium to light brown, again because black or dark brown would be too close to the tiger stripes and blonde would be too close to the tiger fur. I'll come back and add some highlights to this off camera later, but for now I'm just going to use the airbrush in a raking motion to avoid filling in the recesses. For her face, there were three main challenges. First, not having enough access to put my hands in the optimal position. By now, I'm really regretting not taking apart her left arm in addition to her right. I really think it would have made this part of the process much easier to deal with and also easier for you to see because her arm is kind of in the way of the camera being able to see what was going on. Second, I need to make it look like she's not wearing makeup, because I don't think heavy makeup suits this character. And if you are of the makeup wearing persuasion, it'll be no news to you that achieving a pleasing no makeup look is actually harder than it looks. It also doesn't help that I'm aiming for a flushed, red, crying face which shares some overlap with certain makeup looks, so this was pretty tough. But the third and most important of all is, as I said before, the girl is carrying essentially the entire emotional weight of the piece on her shoulders. If she doesn't feel that emotion, if she doesn't feel that grief, we won't feel it. So to say that the pressure is mounting on me to get this right would be quite the understatement. And right about here, this was a real trust the process moment for me. The paint so far has sapped the emotion that I felt was inherent in the sculpt, and it wasn't until I added this last bit of red shading and the crying red eyes that the whole thing came together. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. I was so scared of her face not turning out well that I kept putting it off and putting it off until the very last minute. And that was a terrible idea. I really should have done it first so that if it didn't turn out, I had time to fix it. This was another lesson for me. Do the scary thing first, or at least don't do it last. The more I put a scary task off, the more it builds and builds and builds until it becomes this seemingly monumental task. But live and learn, right? And then we have the spear, which is honestly really straightforward, dark brown for the haft and silver for the metal parts. I did try to give it some dimension by adding a little dry brushing to lift the textures on the haft and shading it down a little bit so that it's darker closer to the spear tip. It's not exactly realistic, but I didn't want the tallest thing you see on the sculpture to be completely flat, so there's that. For the spear tip, I went with kind of an oily metal tint. I wanted it to look a bit dirty and utilitarian. Again, I'm keeping the spear intentionally basic as part of the story, or I suppose more appropriately, the feeling or impression I want you to have while looking at the finished piece. Okay, home stretch, time for the base. First, I prime everything black, just as a starting point, followed by a few layers of earthy chocolate browns, taking it up just a little too bright because I want to apply a whole bunch of washes in the next step. I'm going with a combination of black, dark brown, and green to keep with the earthy tones and add some depth and variety to the surface. Next, I dry brush some of the more vertical surfaces gray. I had intended these to look like exposed rocks, but it didn't really work because I was too messy with the terrain paste and everything had a bumpy texture to it. So I'll switch gears and apply some dark green flock to simulate some mossy growths. I ended up digging this quite a lot, really happy I pivoted and kept light on my feet here. Next comes static grass. It's my first time using static grass on a project, and this did not work very well. It's probably because I'm doing it wrong somehow, because I practiced a bit on some test swatches and it worked fine there, so the kit works, but the fibers didn't really seem to want to stand up on the big base for whatever reason. Anyway, I followed the first layer with more moss because I wanted it to be fluffier, then more static grass using a different applicator because the first one I used broke. And when I say broke, I mean I heard a pop, smelled an electrical burn, and the grass stopped standing up because nothing about this project can be easy. After all that mess, I added some low shrubbery. I think these helped a lot. Having some variation in the terrain really helped sell the foresty green meadow look. And lastly, I added some dollhouse flowers. They're not exactly in the right scale, but I don't even care. I really like the touch of gentleness it adds to the terrain. I did have to drive the flowers down with pins because they were kind of floating on top of the grass and moss without this extra bit of force. And now that the base is done, it's time to put it all together, starting with the girl's body, the tiger, the upper torso, the right arm, and lastly, the spear. And the last little bit to tie it all together. Yeah, I know, but we gotta do it. The scene needs it. I'm sorry if this is upsetting to anyone. Just know I didn't want to do it either. But with that, the sculpture is now finally and truly complete. And when it all comes together, it looks a little something like this. I can say without reservation that this was the most difficult sculpting project I have ever embarked on. Nothing else I've done on this channel comes close. This piece took everything I had to give, and I am incredibly proud of the final result. Of the sculpture, yes, of course, but most of all, I am proud of myself for not giving up, for continuing on, finding new solutions to difficult problems, even when things looked hopeless sometimes. And yes, my friend did like the sculpture very much. Finally, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons on Patreon whose support directly helped me acquire the materials and tools needed for this project. My broken static grass applicator and its replacement salutes you. Thank you guys so much, and welcome to new members, probably Brendan, Arnaud Pourreveau, Laura Avila, Andre Jacobs, Lavone Art, The Creative Hybrid, Andreas M., Troy Nordquist, Ellen Pace, Elise Hogan, Marina Lucio, Bredlin, Kai Edgecombe, Zango75, Soursoul0587, King Cholera, Polite Crow asking if you might kindly open a bin for a little rummage, Kevin Ruiz, Bahaskar Bundaru, Dana Mitkoff, Sam Lamb, Mieoi, Gus, Jonatas Kleisen, and a special thank you to Jay Garris for being a Patron of the Arts tier supporter. If you like the work that I do and would like to help me keep it going, please do check out patreon.com/artchongart. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you again to my wonderful patrons. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.